There's a special kind of pain that comes when someone you care about suddenly goes silent, when the messages stop coming, when the calls go unanswered, when the person who once filled your days with warmth becomes a stranger, leaving you standing in the cold shadow of their absence. You feel it in your chest first, that hollow ache that spreads like ink through water, coloring everything you touch with confusion and hurt. You replay the last conversation, searching for clues, wondering what you did wrong, what you could have done differently. The silence becomes deafening, and in that silence you discover just how much power you've given away. Most people, when faced with this kind of emotional abandonment, follow one of three predictable paths. They beg, sending desperate messages, making calls that go to voicemail, crafting long explanations that sound increasingly pathetic with each word. They block, cutting off all contact in a fit of wounded pride, as if creating digital barriers could somehow protect them from the pain. They lash out, unleashing their hurt in the form of anger, trying to wound the person who wounded them first. But all three responses share the same fundamental flaw. They give away your power. They make you reactive instead of responsive, emotional instead of rational, desperate instead of dignified. There is another way. A path that the ancient Stoics understood with crystal clarity, one that transforms pain into power, reaction into response, and desperation into dignity. This path doesn't require you to block anyone. It doesn't ask you to beg or plead or explain yourself into exhaustion. Instead, it asks you to do something far more powerful and infinitely more difficult. It asks you to become still, to become silent, to become unshakable in the face of another person's indifference. When Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that you have power over your mind, not outside events, realize this, and you will find strength. He was speaking to moments exactly like this. He understood that the greatest battles aren't fought with swords or shields, but with the quiet discipline of inner mastery. The emperor who ruled the known world knew that true power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling yourself. And in that control, in that stillness, lies a strength that no silence, no rejection, no abandonment can touch. The first thing you must understand is that their silence is not about you, it's about them. People who disappear without explanation, who withdraw their attention like a punishment, who use silence as a weapon. These are people who have never learned to communicate with integrity. They're ruled by their emotions, driven by impulses. They don't understand, trapped in patterns they can't break. When you react to their silence with desperation, you're not just hurting yourself, you're enabling their dysfunction. You're teaching them that their silence has power over you, their absence can control your emotions, that their withdrawal can determine your worth. But what if you chose a different response? What if instead of chasing them into their silence, you simply let them go? Not with anger, not with resentment, not with the dramatic flourish of blocking or the desperate grasping of constant contact attempts. What if you let them go with the quiet dignity of someone who knows their own worth? What if you chose to remain still, to remain silent, to remain unmoved by their games? This is where the real power lies. In the space between stimulus and response, between their action and your reaction, there exists a moment of choice. And in that moment, you can choose to be governed by your emotions, or you can choose to be governed by your wisdom. You can choose to be reactive, or you can choose to be responsive. You can choose to be desperate, or you can choose to be dignified. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, understood this principle deeply. He wrote, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." When someone withdraws from your life, when they choose silence over communication, when they disappear without explanation, they're not taking something from you, they're giving you something. They're giving you the opportunity to discover who you are when you're not defined by their attention. They're giving you the chance to find your center, your strength, your peace in the absence of their validation. This is not about playing games. This is not about manipulation or strategy or trying to make them come back. This is about something far more fundamental. This is about reclaiming your power. This is about remembering that your worth is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you treat yourself. This is about understanding that their silence says nothing about your value and everything about their character. When you choose stillness over reaction, when you choose silence over explanation, When you choose dignity over desperation, something profound happens. You stop being a victim of their choices and start being the author of your own story. Stop waiting for them to validate your worth and start validating it yourself. You stop needing their attention to feel complete and start finding completion in your own presence. This doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you become discerning. You learn to distinguish between people who deserve your energy and people who drain it. You learn to recognize the difference between healthy communication and manipulative games. You learn to value consistency over intensity, reliability over passion, character over charm. Epictetus tuned something about powerlessness. Having spent years as a slave before becoming one of history's greatest teachers, teachers understood that true freedom comes not from controlling your circumstances, but from controlling your responses to them. He taught that we suffer not from the things that happen to us, but from our judgments about the things that happen to us. When someone goes silent, the silence itself is neutral. It's our interpretation of that silence, our judgment that it means we're not worthy, not lovable, not enough that causes our suffering. But what if you chose a different interpretation? What if their silence wasn't a judgment on your worth, but simply information about their character? What if their withdrawal wasn't a punishment, but a gift, the gift of clarity about who they really are and what they're capable of giving? What if their absence wasn't a loss, but a liberation from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from someone who doesn't know how to give it? This shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of seeing their silence as something you need to fix or overcome, start seeing it as something you need to accept and learn from. Instead of seeing their withdrawal as a problem to be solved, you start seeing it as a boundary to be respected. Instead of seeing their absence as a void to be filled, you start seeing it as space to be inhabited space, where you can rediscover who you are when you're not performing for someone else's approval. When you stop chasing, something beautiful happens. You start attracting. When you stop explaining yourself, people start listening. When you stop trying to prove your worth becomes self-evident. This is the paradox of Stoic detachment. By caring less about outcomes, you create better outcomes. By needing less from others, you inspire them to give more. By expecting less, you often receive more than you ever imagined. But here's the crucial point. This isn't about manipulation. This isn't about playing hard to get or using silence as a weapon. This is about genuine inner transformation. This is about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need external validation to feel whole. This is about developing such a strong sense of self that other people's opinions, actions, and choices can't shake your foundation. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does." When someone goes silent, your instinct might be to analyze every detail, to search for clues, to try to understand their motivations. But this is precisely the wrong approach. Their motivations are none of your business. Their reasons are not your responsibility. Their silence is not your problem to solve. Your only responsibility is to yourself. Your only job is to remain centered, grounded and true to your own values, regardless of how others choose to behave. When you focus on controlling what you can control, your thoughts, your actions, your responses, you free yourself from the exhausting work of trying to control what you cannot control, other people's choices. This is where the magic happens. When you stop trying to make them communicate, you start communicating more effectively with yourself. When you stop trying to make them care, you start caring more deeply for yourself. When you stop trying to make them choose you, you start choosing yourself with such conviction that you become magnetic to people who appreciate real strength. The person who can remain calm in the face of another's silence possesses a power that goes far beyond what most people understand. They possess the power of non-reactivity, possess the power of emotional independence, possess the power of inner peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. This is the power that the Stoics cultivated through daily practice, through constant self-examination, through the relentless pursuit of wisdom over emotion. Seneca taught that the mind that is not baffled is not employed. When someone's silence confuses you, frustrates you, or hurts you, that's your mind being employed. That's your consciousness being engaged with something that ultimately doesn't serve your growth. But when you learn to remain unbaffled by their silence, when you learn to remain employed by your own development rather than their attention, you discover a freedom that no one can take from you. This freedom doesn't come overnight. It requires practice, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. It requires you to develop what the Stoics called preferred indifference, the ability to prefer certain outcomes while remaining emotionally unattached to whether or not they occur. You can prefer that people communicate with you clearly and consistently, but you cannot allow your peace to depend on whether they do. When you master this balance, when you learn to hold your preferences lightly while holding your values firmly, you become unstoppable. You become the kind of person who attracts healthy relationships because you're not desperate for any relationship. You become the kind of person who inspires respect because you respect yourself too much to chase people who don't appreciate your presence. The most powerful thing you can do when someone goes silent is to honor that silence. Not by matching it with desperate attempts to break it, but by respecting it as their choice and focusing on your own choices. Honor their silence by using it as an opportunity to deepen your relationship with yourself. Honor their absence by filling that space with activities, thoughts, and people that actually enrich your life. This is not about being cold or unfeeling. This is about being wise. This is about understanding that your emotional well-being cannot depend on another person's behavior. This is about recognizing that true strength comes not from getting others to act the way you want them to act, but from remaining peaceful regardless of how they choose to act. Epictetus taught his students that it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. When someone withdraws their attention, communication, or presence from your life, that's what happens to you. But your reaction, whether you chase or remain still, whether you beg or remain dignified, whether you explain or remain silent, that's entirely up to you. And in that choice lies all of your power. The person who can let others go without bitterness, who can be ignored without losing their center, who can face silence without filling it with desperate noise, this person has achieved something rare and beautiful. They have achieved emotional independence. They have learned to source their peace from within rather than from others. They have developed a kind of inner strength that makes them attractive to people who are capable of genuine connection. When you stop needing their response, you often get it. When you stop needing their attention, you often earn it. When you stop needing their validation, you often receive it. But more importantly, when you stop needing these things, you realize you never actually needed them in the first place. You realize that your worth was never dependent on their recognition. You realize that your completeness was never contingent on their presence. This realization is both humbling and empowering. It's humbling because it forces you to take responsibility for your own emotional well-being. It's empowering because it reveals that you have everything you need within yourself to be happy, peaceful, and fulfilled. You don't need anyone else to complete you, validate you, or make you feel worthy. You are complete, you are valid, you are worthy. Not because of what others think of you, but because of who you are. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that very little is needed to make a happy life. When you stop depending on others for your happiness, when you stop needing their attention to feel alive, when you stop requiring their validation to feel valuable, you discover the truth of his words. Very little is needed indeed: peace, purpose, self-respect, the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud of who you're becoming, the strength to let others be themselves without taking it personally, the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent. This is the path of the Stoic, not the path of the victim, who needs others to behave a certain way in order to feel okay, not the path of the aggressor who tries to force others to give them what they want, but the path of the sage who has learned to find everything they need within themselves, who has learned to love without attachment, who has learned to care without dependence. When you walk this path, when you embody this wisdom, you become a different kind of person. You become someone who doesn't need to block anyone because you're not threatened by their presence. You become someone who doesn't need to beg anyone because you're not desperate for their attention. You become someone who doesn't need to explain yourself because your actions speak louder than your words. You become someone who can be ignored without losing their dignity, who can be rejected without losing their worth, who can be abandoned without losing their peace. You become someone who attracts healthy love because you're not desperate for any love. You become someone who inspires respect because you respect yourself too much to chase people who don't appreciate your value. This transformation doesn't happen because you're trying to get a specific person to come back. It happens because you're committed to becoming the kind of person who no longer needs anyone to come back in order to feel complete. It happens because you're choosing growth over stagnation, wisdom over emotion, dignity over desperation. The silence that once tortured you becomes a teacher. The absence that once devastated you becomes a gift. The rejection that once crushed you becomes a redirection towards something better. Not because you're trying to make the best of a bad situation, but because you're learning to see clearly what was always true, that your peace, your worth, your completeness was never dependent on another person's behavior, Seneca wrote. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, who is poor. When you stop craving their attention, their validation, their presence, you discover that you were never poor. You discover that you have everything you need. You discover that their silence cannot diminish you unless you allow it to. You discover that their absence cannot complete you unless you believe it can. This is the ultimate freedom, the freedom to be yourself, regardless of how others choose to treat you. The freedom to maintain your peace, regardless of whether others appreciate it. The freedom to hold your dignity regardless of whether others respect it. The freedom to know your worth regardless of whether others recognize it. When you achieve this freedom, you don't need to block anyone because you're not threatened by their energy. You don't need to beg anyone because you're not desperate for their attention. You don't need to explain yourself because your self-respect speaks for itself. You simply become still. You become silent. You become unshakable. And in that stillness, in that silence, in that unshakable presence, you discover a power that no one can take from you. This is not about revenge. This is not about making them regret their choice. This is not about punishing them for their silence. This is about something far more profound. This is about choosing peace over pettiness, dignity over desperation, wisdom over emotion. This is about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need others to behave a certain way in order to feel okay. This is about discovering that your happiness, your peace, your worth was never dependent on their approval. The Stoics understood that true power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling yourself. Not from making others act the way you want them to act, but from acting the way you want to act regardless of how others behave. Not from getting others to validate you, but from validating yourself so completely that others' opinions become irrelevant. This is the path of the sage, the path of the person who has learned to find everything they need within themselves. It's a path of the person who can love without attachment, care without dependence, hope without desperation. The path of the person who can be ignored without losing their center, rejected without losing their worth, abandoned without losing their peace. When you walk this path, you don't just survive others' silence, you transcend it. You don't just endure their absence, you transform it into presence. You don't just tolerate their rejection, you alchemize it into self-acceptance. You become not just someone who can handle being ignored, but someone who doesn't need to be noticed to feel alive. You become not just someone who can survive without their attention, but someone who can thrive in the beautiful silence of your own company. This is the gift of Stoic wisdom, the recognition that everything you've been seeking outside yourself was always available within yourself. The love you wanted them to give you, you can give to yourself. The validation you needed them to provide, you can provide for yourself. The peace you hoped they would bring to your life, you can cultivate in your own heart. And when you do, when you finally stop looking outside yourself for what can only be found within, something beautiful happens. You become magnetic to people who are capable of genuine connection. You become attractive to people who appreciate real strength. You become irresistible to people who recognize authentic worth. Not because you're trying to attract them, but because you're no longer desperate for their attention. It's not because you're playing games, but because you're living in truth. This is the ultimate paradox of Stoic detachment. By needing less from others, you inspire them to give more. By explaining yourself less, you communicate more effectively. By chasing less, you attract more. By caring less about outcomes, you create better outcomes. By being less reactive, you become more magnetic. By being less desperate, you become more desirable. But remember, this isn't about manipulation. This isn't about strategy. This isn't about trying to get a specific person to come back. This is about genuine transformation. This is about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need anyone to come back in order to feel complete. This is about discovering that your peace, your joy, your fulfillment was never dependent on another person's choices. When you truly understand this, when you embody this wisdom, you become unstoppable. You become the kind of person who can be ignored without losing their dignity, who can be rejected without losing their worth, who can be abandoned without losing their peace. You become the kind of person who attracts healthy relationships because you're not desperate for any relationship. You become the kind of person who inspires respect because you respect yourself too much to chase people who don't appreciate your presence. This is the path of the Stoic sage, the path of inner mastery, the path of emotional independence, the path of finding everything you need within yourself, the path of choosing peace over pettiness, dignity over desperation, wisdom over emotion, the path of becoming so complete within yourself that others' approval becomes irrelevant, their attention becomes optional, their presence becomes a gift rather than a need. Walk this path, embrace this wisdom, choose this strength, and watch as your life transforms, not because others change, but because you do. Watch as your relationships improve, not because you control them, but because you control yourself. Watch as your peace deepens, not because your circumstances become perfect, but because you become unshakable regardless of your circumstances. This is the promise of Stoic philosophy, that you can find everything you're looking for within yourself, that you can be complete without another person's validation. You can be happy without controlling others' behavior. You can be at peace regardless of how others choose to treat you. This is not just philosophy. This is freedom. This is not just wisdom. This is power. This is not just knowledge. This is transformation. The silence that once hurt you becomes the space where you discover your strength. The absence that once devastated you becomes the emptiness you fill with your own presence. The rejection that once crushed you becomes the redirection that leads you home to yourself. Not because you're making the best of a bad situation, but because you're finally seeing clearly what was always true, that everything you need is already within you.